Now, since this horror has begun, I've been really honoured to be able to speak to just the most compelling possible voices. And right at the top is Dan Buttu, who is a former member of the Palestinian negotiating team, lawyer, writer. Also now we're both at Zetio, Mehdi Hassan's new media project, but just a brilliant commentator, so full of expertise, insight, knowledge. So, Dan, it's an honour to speak to you, albeit always slightly depressing in these bleak times. But we spoke, I think, about 4 months ago, and a lot's happened since then. So, firstly, hello, by the way. Hope you're well.
I'm well, thank you, Owen. Thanks for having me on again.
I should say for everyone, we'll talk about this, but Dan's in Haifa, which is a town in Israel with a very large Palestinian population, Palestinian citizens of Israel. But we'll talk about that in terms of the climate in Israeli society. But first, I just want to ask you actually about the latest developments in terms of when I spoke to you earlier this year, you used the phrase, which struck me, and was obviously very accurate, that you saw this as an Israeli-American attack. And what's striking is all the way through, of course, the US has facilitated this genocidal onslaught every step of the way. Arms, military, diplomatic support, occasionally hand-wringing to media outlets but Biden's really lost his temper this time privately as opposition in US society has grown. But now President Biden's actually come out and said he's going to stop. They've already delayed one lot of shipment of weapons, and now they're talking about no more shipments of weapons if an onslaught against Rafah happens properly. I just wondered what you thought about all that. What do you think? What's the significance of this, do you think?
It's perplexing, Owen, because Israel has been attacking Rafah since day one. And even when they took over Rafah the other day, they not only took over the border crossing, but they went into very heavily populated centers with over 100,000 Palestinians then fleeing. So it's not entirely clear to me where that red line is for him. Am I happy that he's finally articulating a kind of red line, maybe a pink line? Yes, but it needs to be much more than that. And I think the US public and I think the Israeli public also know that all it really takes is one phone call for President Biden to make this stop. And the reason that it only takes one phone call is because it's been the US who's been supplying the weaponry. They've been giving the diplomatic support. They've been making sure that other countries around the world are continuing their shipments to Israel. They've done everything possible to carry out this war, which is why Palestinians call this the American-Israeli genocide of Palestinians in Gaza.
It's such an important point you made about Rafah. There's this a Palestinian former journalist called Nahada who we've been working on trying to get him out with his family, including the kids of his brother who was killed by the Israeli state, and they've been forced to flee Rafah. He originally they went to Khan Yunis and they just said it's like he said it's like an end of the world film. It's like an apocalyptic film. Just in terms of where you think this is 7 months in. I just think often people don't realize, for example, how small Gaza is. We're talking about a strip of land about the size of East London. A state armed by the world's only remaining superpower has unleashed hell against, and I'm quoting there what an Israeli military figure promised at the very beginning. You wanted hell, we'll give you hell, as one Israeli general said at the very beginning. Where do you think things are at in terms of just strategically for Israel? Because they haven't got obviously huge numbers of their hostages back, and the only ones they got back was because of a prisoner release and ceasefire. And Hamas has not been defeated. 7 months in, I don't know. I think that's not really, people haven't really discussed this enough, what kind of strategic defeat Israel's suffering here. It's
suffering a catastrophic strategic defeat. And they know it. And this is why, they've been genocidal from the beginning, but I don't think people truly understand just how more genocidal Israeli society is today. For example, on a daily basis, you hear statements from politicians talking about flattening Gaza. And it's not just politicians, it's members of the press, it's commentators, it's ordinary people in the streets. You see bumper stickers everywhere. There's a hat that's very popular here that says "Make Gaza Flat Again." And so all of this is happening because, as you put it, they haven't been able to meet any of the so-called goals that they wanted to meet. Now, we have to step back and ask about those so-called goals. Now, Israel said that they had 3 goals. One was to release the Israelis. The second one was to defeat Hamas. And the third was to make sure that this is not possible again. The problem is that they know that they can't release Israelis without a ceasefire, and they know it. And it's been clear after 7 months. And so all that they've been doing is destroying and destroying and destroying, because I think that the ultimate goal for them is genocide. And Netanyahu made this clear from day one, and he keeps continuing with it. And their actions are speaking much larger than words. I think that they were hoping to have a genocide coupled with a white flag, coupled with the release of the Israelis. And all that they haven't been able to get the Israelis back, and they haven't been able to get that white flag. So the one thing that they have been able to do is to destroy Gaza as much as possible. When you say it's apocalyptic, I don't even think apocalyptic can describe what it's like today in Gaza. The friends that I have there are describing conditions that I don't think any human should be living under. And I don't think we should be playing up as somehow Palestinians are strong. That's a form of dehumanization. They're living without food, without water, without electricity, without proper health care. 30 of the 36 hospitals have been bombed. There are no schools left. Every university has been destroyed. 80% of homes have been flattened. And you're talking about an area that is 26 miles long by 12 miles wide at its widest point, that already was the most densely populated place on earth. Now in the south, where people have fled to Rafah, it's approximately 1.7 million people that are in 1/3 of that space that I just talked about. So you can just imagine what the conditions are like for people there. It's beyond apocalyptic.
Well, it's such a crucial point that you made there about an attack on Rafah has been ongoing since day one. And if you just looked at Rafah in isolation, if that was just, since this began, if this was somewhere else, people would regard this as ruinous in terms of just the devastation inflicted on Rafah. The point is just relative to the rest of Gaza, it has, it's been less severely destroyed. And I guess I wonder is, the point there in terms of, because they, Khan Yunis originally, and Khan Yunis people, for those who don't know, it's in the southern part of Gaza. Towards the beginning, there was this idea of the claims of the Israeli state: flee south and you'll be safe there, and that it will be spared the level of destruction of the north. But actually, Khan Yunis, I think, has been more severely destroyed than even Gaza City has been destroyed. I mean, if Rafah is destroyed, then they basically, the argument they could present is, well, it's not habitable place anymore, Gaza, and therefore its entire population will have to leave. And if they don't, that's what they said at the beginning. General Gior Island, starve or die. And he's an advisor to Gallant. So do you think that's part of it? You destroy Rafah, you then argue, well, there's nowhere for you to go anymore.
Yes, and that was the plan from the beginning on. So within the first week, you may recall that there was a former Israeli foreign minister, Danny Danon, appeared on Mark Lamont Hill's show on Al Jazeera, and he said we should be pushing Palestinians from Gaza into the Sinai and creating tent cities, with these tent cities then paid for by the Gulf states. And nobody questioned him. Nobody within mainstream media questioned other Israelis and said, is this the official policy of the Israeli state? Yes, he's a former, but you can imagine if a former Palestinian minister of any sort issued any type of statement, they'd be going after the current government, asking for clarification. Well, nobody did when it came to Danny Danon. And then sure enough, within a month, or within actually 2 weeks, we ended up seeing a document that was going around, a funding request to actually create these tent cities in Gaza in the event that people need to flee. This was a document that came out in Congress from the White House. And so the plan has been clear since the beginning. And that's why what you now see is that if you think about life from the perspective of a Gazan, let's say that they want to go to university, and let's assume that there's a ceasefire tomorrow, which I'm not sure there will be. Assuming that there's one tomorrow, a person wants to go to university. Where are they going to do it? Outside of Gaza. If they need to get health care, because many of them will need health care, where are they going to do it? Outside of Gaza. You want to get a job or practice your profession, where are you going to do it? Outside of Gaza. And so Israel's point from the very beginning was to flatten Gaza, to make it uninhabitable. And this is why we've heard statements from Jared Kushner and others saying that there's practically nothing left. The point is to make life miserable for Palestinians so that they either get killed off or they flee. And one of the things that has been that, when you have friends in Gaza who talk about what life is like, is they tell me, one friend who just left just 2 weeks ago said that the thing that struck him the most after he left was that he didn't have the stench of death any longer, that he wasn't smelling that 24 hours a day. That's what Gaza has been turned into. Israel has turned it into killing fields.
The Israeli-American professor Omar Bartov, I interviewed him many months ago, and he made, I guess, a very disturbing, chilling point about the dynamic between what we would describe as ethnic cleansing and genocide, and how ethnic cleansing becomes genocide because you try and force people up, but lots of people, they don't want to leave their homes, and therefore you murder them and you subject them to conditions which, in the case we see with famine. I mean, they said from the beginning, Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, we're fighting human animals and we will cut off all the essentials of life. And they stuck to their words. I mean, do you think that's the point? Basically their point is, we don't want Palestinians to be in Gaza. How that is achieved, how many, we will kill a certain number and others will die because we have deprived them of the basis of life. But the end game is Gaza will no longer have Palestinians living there. And that's what they're trying to achieve.
That's precisely it. And Owen, it's also important to keep in mind that the Israelis knew and were calculating exactly what the caloric intake was of Palestinians in the years of the blockade. And so they know precisely the amounts that are needed to sustain life. And that's why they decided to cut everything off. And even with the very little humanitarian aid that is trickling in, they know that it's not enough to sustain life. And that's the point, is Israel's committing genocide. And it's sad to say, but none of the world powers, as we know it, are actually doing anything to stop it. We do have other countries that are pushing ahead, such as South Africa and others that have been at the forefront of making sure that Israel is held to account, and also to try to stop the genocide. But the major superpower, which is the United States, has done nothing other than to become part of this, and is not only funding and fueling this, but is providing diplomatic cover as well.
I mean, in terms of just that prospect, you said you doubted a ceasefire would happen, and we saw Hamas say they'd accepted the outline presented by Egypt, and immediately Israel, poo-pooed that. They took the Rafah crossing, which is crucial for aid to get into, whatever limited aid gets into Gaza. Not that you can distribute it. They've destroyed roads. They've made it as impossible as as it can be to distribute the aid. But I mean, what do you think in terms of now that Joe Biden is under domestic pressure? In fact, as a poll by Zetio found, a large majority of Democratic voters think that genocide is being committed by Israel. More Americans do not think genocide is being committed by Israel, which is quite astonishing if you think about where American public opinion used to be on the issue of Israel and how difficult it was to even be critical of Israel. But because of that, he's under pressure because he faces Donald Trump in 6 months. And there's a good chance a significant number of his voters will think, I just cannot bring myself to vote for a candidate who has facilitated genocide. I have to live with myself. That's just how people feel. They'll get screamed at by Biden supporters who will just guilt trip them into doing otherwise. But that's the reality. So I just wondered, do you think now that pressure, in terms of weapons, now they've got enough weapons to just flatten Rafah, even if no shipments happen. But what do you think? Do you think there's any prospect, or do you think Netanyahu will just plow ahead and Rafah will be ravaged?
I think he's going to plow ahead. And the reason I think that is because I don't think that Joe Biden's statements have been strong enough. And also, you have to position yourself in the shoes of Netanyahu. He's a deeply unpopular prime minister. He was deeply unpopular before the 7th of October. And since because of all of the corruption scandals that he was facing, you'll recall that there had been 7 months of sustained weekly protests against him. What's now happened is that Israelis are recognizing that there is no way that they are going to be able to release any of the Israelis without having some measure of a ceasefire. And so he recognizes that his political life is on the line. He's got his political life that's on the line, both from the right wing, who is saying that they should just be nuking Gaza. Those are their words, not mine. And he also has it from the political, I don't want to say left, because there really is no left wing in Israel, but the less fascist right wing, who is also saying that he needs to reach an agreement and he needs to have a ceasefire. They're not saying ceasefire because they care about Palestinian lives. They're just saying ceasefire because they do want to see the Israelis returned. And so either way, for him, it doesn't really make sense to stop. Instead, he's going to gamble and take the gamble that Israelis will somehow love him if the final phases of genocide are actually successful. That's the gamble that he is taking right now. And given the lack of U.S. leadership on this issue, you can see why he's going to take that gamble.
I mean, that's what I'm wondering about in terms of endgame there, because as you know, I mean, if we look at the polling of Jewish Israelis, and the reason I say that for everyone's benefit is because a fifth of the population of Palestinian citizens of Israel, and their views are very different from. But you know, the polling is bleak. I mean, about 60% have opposed all humanitarian aid getting into Gaza, which is genocidal by definition. About as many think too little firepower has been used on Gaza as think just enough has been used, with about 2% saying too much firepower has been used. That's what we're talking about. I think that context is important. But nonetheless, now more say they prioritize rescuing those Israelis being held than an onslaught on Rafah. So I'm just wondering how that ends for him if he's seen as not being able to get those hostages back, but continuing with that Rafah offensive. Is that not going to produce an ever greater backlash? Or do you just think, well, if he basically just end up with Gaza being permanently destroyed, then that will compensate for that with the Israeli society? How does it work in the end?
That's a great question, Owen. The problem with Israeli society is they aren't thinking beyond the immediate day-to-day of genocide. Yeah, I can share with you some conversations that I've had with people when I ask them, is 15,000 kids being killed by Israel acceptable? And a shrug. And then I think, okay, well, what about 20,000? What about 25,000? Is there a number that is going to be acceptable? And it's just passed off as this is just par for the course. This is the price, is what I'm told. And so I don't think that Israelis have really thought it through. The reason that they haven't thought it through is because, again, nobody has been forcing Netanyahu to articulate anything other than his vision for genocide. So for Israelis, they've now resigned themselves to the fact that this is what the way it's going to be, and that's terrifying. As a Palestinian living in this society, it's terrifying to have as your neighbors people who look around and say, 15,000 kids being killed is just the price. 40,000 dead is just a price, or 10,000 who are still stuck under rubble is just a price, or the flattening of the largest Palestinian city is just a price. It's so genocidal that all that they're thinking about is just these small little things and not the bigger picture of what this is going to lead to. There's no way that this, and I say this over and over again, there's no way that Israel is going to come out looking good in this. There's no way that Israel is going to ever be victorious in this, ever.
Well, on that, because I mean, that's a very crucial point that I did want to discuss with you. I mean, I was on Irish television yesterday with, I think, the only pro-Israel politician in Ireland. They really had to, I mean, for all these historic reasons, obviously Ireland was subjugated, obviously, by the British and starved and suffered horrific atrocities. So Ireland has more of a natural affinity, obviously, with the Palestinian cause than most European nations. though the polling is pretty clear in Britain and elsewhere, which is, overwhelmingly opposed to Israel's genocidal onslaught. But it was just striking because he did the whole kind of going on about student placards, student slogans, which I just find the most desperate attempt to turn the world upside down, given the rhetoric of Israeli politicians. And just on that, because sometimes I see these clips from Israeli television, which are translated. There's a brilliant, he's an Israeli Jewish peace activist who's anonymous. He's called I Really Hate You on Twitter. And he's absolutely brilliant, just translates all these, and you watch it, it's just, because I remember all the kind of liberal hand-wringing quite understandably, about Russian television clips saying terrible things about Ukraine. But you'll see clips where people say, let's kill all the kids because they grow up to be terrorists. I just wonder, is that what that's where we're at with a lot of Israelis? It's such a level of dehumanization. Because you mentioned about the kind of shrugging off of children who are being slaughtered and maimed. But they look at them all and they just see would-be monsters, don't they? They don't see them as children, as far as I can tell, a lot of ordinary citizens, with great courageous exceptions.
With few exceptions. A lot of it, Owen, is I can refer to some of the television broadcasts that you see. At the beginning, they used to put the numbers of Palestinians who were killed. This was in the early days when it was still possible to get numbers. I'm sure you know this, but today we don't actually have an accurate count of the number of Palestinians who've been killed because the hospital system has collapsed and there's no real way to know. Plus, there's so many who are still trapped under the rubble, very sadly. And so in the early days, within probably about the first month of this genocide, the Israelis were posting numbers of Palestinians killed. And the way that they posted it was number of terrorists killed. And that so-called terrorist included babies. It included babies that were 2 and 3 days old. It included, you name it. And so there's just been the only way that you can sustain a colonial project in the way that Israel has sustained it is through a very deep dehumanization process. And that's why you've seen everything from the dehumanization of Palestinian children, the dehumanization of everything Palestinian. That's why you see that it's considered acceptable to torture Palestinians. And I'm sure you've seen the videos of particularly men from Gaza who are forced to crawl on all fours, naked, bark, swear at Hamas, and do all sorts of things, as well as people who've been shackled to the point where circulation gets cut off and they need to have limbs amputated. That only comes as the result of years of dehumanization. And that's what Israel has been doing to Palestinians since before 1948, since before the Nakba.
But before I just talk to you about what you just mentioned before about why actually Israel, because I keep saying Israel is going to lose this. That's been the theme of many of the videos I've been over the last few weeks. I just want to talk to you, just ask you about, because I mentioned there in passing Palestinian citizens of Israel, about a fifth of the population. I did a video where I interviewed a couple of colleagues, associates, Professor Nadira Shalhoub-Kevorkian, a feminist Palestinian legal scholar who was arrested by Israeli state. The reason I'm just asking is, the polling has always been clear. Obviously, the Palestinian citizens of Israel have a very different view, but there's a climate of fear about speaking out. I'm just wondering, I am wondering, some Palestinian citizens of Israel have relatives in Gaza and the West Bank where there's a reign of terror.
Yes.
What's happening at the moment? Is there just a sense of kind of being cowed, fearing, speaking out? Is there any kind of potential political expression, or is it just too much fear for that to, for something to be galvanized there?
Thank you for that question, Owen. It's very important. I'll describe what it's like to live here. Now, I always say, I wasn't born here. I wasn't raised here. So it's always a little bit awkward for me to speak on behalf of a community that I was not born into. I wasn't raised, but I have lived here for quite some time. And I hope that gives me a little bit of experience to be able to talk about what life is like here. To be a Palestinian who holds Israeli citizenship means that you are the descendants of people who survived the 1948 Nakba. And the 1948 Nakba, yes, it was 76 years ago, and less televised as we see happening today, but also very brutal, with the ethnic cleansing of 750,000 Palestinians, that's 75% of the population, the destruction of over 500 villages and towns, including my father's village and town. And then having to live amongst the very people who destroyed your city, who destroyed your town, who destroyed your community, who have killed your relatives, who's thrown your relatives into exile. And you had to live amongst these people. And so my father was one of the survivors of the Nakba. And so this community ended up rebuilding itself from scratch. It succeeded despite Israel, not because of Israel. But because they've succeeded, they've also learned to have these coping mechanisms of how to deal with being in a system where all around you, it's people who want to get rid of you, who make it clear that the only reason that you're still around is because they didn't, quote unquote, finish the job in 1948. So immediately in the aftermath of October the 7th, what we saw happening was that there was a massive crackdown against Palestinians in Israel. And the crackdown was, and this part's important, the crackdown was for social media posts. It was for liking a picture. It was for putting an emoji up. It was for saying something as benign as "there is no victor but God." That's what Dalal Abu Amni, a neuroscientist and singer, wrote. And what happened was that the people who snitched on you were the very people who have worked with you. They're your colleagues. If you're a student, they were people in your study group. They may have been your neighbors. And so what they did was your neighbors, your study group, your colleagues were taking screenshots and then sending it to the police, with hundreds of people being arrested for supporting terror, or in some cases inciting, or in some cases they ended up being disciplined from university for a simple thing of, one of them was a man sitting on rubble with a little emoji of a broken heart. So for Palestinians, you're absolutely right. Many of us have family in Gaza. Many of us have family in the West Bank. Many of us have family in both places. And you're not allowed to say anything for fear of being arrested, for fear of losing your job, for fear of being kicked out of university, or even worse than that. One man was held in prison for 122 days just for trying to organize a protest. Nadra, whom you interviewed, was also arrested for saying what I'm saying, which is that this is genocide, and with colleagues going after you and you name it. But it doesn't just stop there. Even people like Dalal Abu Amni, the singer who just wrote "There is no victor but God," since her release from prison, for the past since the end of October, so we're now talking 6 months, each and every day there are protesters in front of her house calling for her and her husband, who's a deputy director at a hospital, to be expelled from the city. They call on her to be killed. They call on her to be raped. They've put up pictures of her all over the city between crosshairs. They've renamed her street the IDF Street. The mayor has participated in all of these protests and in fact ran his entire campaign on having her expelled from the city. So this is what it's like. This is not just a climate of fear, but it's a climate in which you feel that you are next because they make you feel as though you are next. And they've told you that the only reason that you're still here is because they didn't finish the job in 1948. So it leaves you to question, is now the time that they're going to finish the job?
Makes sense. Grim, but brilliantly put. The final thing I want to talk to you about, Gaza, as we've discussed, has been devastated beyond the imagination of the vast majority of people. Even when we spend time, I think, looking at footage, nothing could prepare people, based on those I speak to, who've been there, for what you actually see and witness with all your senses. Mass devastation, one of the great slaughters of our time, through violent deaths, but also destruction of the healthcare system, famine, the basis of life, all those conditions made impossible for people. The West Bank, a murderous reign of terror. All the while, the US has bankrolled militarily, supported, offered diplomatic support. Why are we so convinced? Why are we so convinced Israel has lost? Because that's what I've been saying. But I want to hear from you. Why people might look at that and think, this is they're going to get away with it. This is a catastrophe beyond our imagination, or the imagination of most people alive. But they've got the superpower, the last superpower on earth, on their side. They've got away with this. Why have they lost?
Because Israel was banking on the fact that it could continue to do the low-grade slaughter of Palestinians for an indefinite period of time, and that it could continue to get international support and be lauded somehow as a democracy rather than the racist, fascist, apartheid state that it actually is. And now that is gone. That is gone. And what do I mean by that? For, Israelis here talk about how this feels existential for them. And I have to say it is existential. You know why? Because what's at stake now is this idea of being a racist, fascist, apartheid regime that is allowed to conduct its actions with impunity. I think that part is no longer going to be there any longer. I think what we're seeing now is a complete awakening by the world of what Israel is actually about and what its goals have always been since before 1948 and what its goals are now. So rather than it having this veneer of democracy, rather than having this veneer of being a normal state, that veneer has now been completely and totally removed. And you see everything from students on campuses in the United States, and not just in the United States, actually around the world, who are demanding that their universities no longer invest in genocide. We see that protests are all around the world demanding boycotts, divestment, sanctions. We hear countries talking about arms embargoes. We hear this idea that of even settlers now being sanctioned. Wow. Things that we would have never even heard about just a few years ago. Remember, a few years ago, we were on the brink of all states within the Arab world, or most states in the Arab world, normalizing relations with Israel and ignoring Palestinians. That's not going to happen any longer. And so this idea of win for them, they wanted to be able to get rid of Palestinians and have the veneer of being an acceptable, democratic, loved state. And they can't do that any longer. One final point, Owen, is when I look at the protests that are happening in the United States, people are often comparing them to the anti-war protests of 1968, and neither you nor I were around during that era. But one thing that was different during those protests was that those were protests that were involving U.S. troops and a U.S. war. This time around, this isn't about U.S. troops. This is about what kind of society it is that we want to be living in, and what do we want us as a society to be representing? And is Israel representing those ideals and those values that we believe in? And that's why I firmly believe that when you have people around the world who are talking about this, not just about their immediate, but about the bigger pictures, it's not just about their soldiers, but about the bigger picture, there is no way that Israel's going to win.
And just finally on that, I've just written a column for enough comparing with Vietnam War protests and the way they've, I think, often been misrepresented. Actually, most college students in 1967 wanted escalation, let alone and opposed de-escalation. So the protesters were isolated even amongst their own cohort. There's a very different context now. But it strikes me that I've often described in the last few months Israel as a genocidal hothouse, where it just kind of it has an internal dynamic that just spins out of control. And a kind of strategic response by Israel would be to look at what's happening. They'd look at, particularly in the US, their main patron supplies the weapons, diplomatic support. And they think, look, we're massively repelling these people. Particularly, there's a young generation of younger Jewish Americans who are leading these protests. Panic, panic, panic. We need to do something. But they actually go the other way. It makes them more defensive. It makes them almost kind of like punch harder. But that's something's got to give, hasn't it? Because it's going to boil over. And the gap between them and where Western public opinion is just, there's just a divorce, and then who's gonna prop them up?
I don't think that anybody wants to be investing in societies that view themselves as being superior. And that's what Israel is. It's a society that's based on this notion of Jewish supremacy and the ability to do no wrong. And people look around and they say, genocide is not acceptable, not in any context. And I think that's the plot that Israel has missed.
Pretty put. I think an extremely convincing case for why Israel has already lost. It doesn't realize it's lost, but it has clearly lost, notwithstanding the catastrophic consequences which will continue for the Palestinian people. But I think Dana has just again proven why such an incredible, invaluable voice, which we're so lucky to have. So do share the video, press like and subscribe, leave your comments. Love to hear your thoughts. But Dan, honestly, such an honor to have you as ever. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Owen. Thanks for doing what you do.
Always right back at you.